Wow. Hey. Pura vida, mi gente. How you guys doing? Much love and respect. Thanks for tuning in once again. Appreciate you guys making the time to be here, especially in the middle of the day like this on your Thursday. Appreciate you guys. Thank you, especially everybody here in the live chat. Shout out to you. All right. Real quick, the image on the left right here is from this image right here. That's the whole family. It's a Kalinago Carib family from Sandy Bay, St. Vincent. That's Captain George, his wife, and kids from 1880. All right. So-called Black Caribs, so-called, right? This is a painting from Agustin Brunias from like the 1600s, I think, of the so-called Black Caribs of St. Vincent. All right. Uh, this is like a little close-up of it. And this is another painting I got. I did a little short the other day just on this. I'm showing, this is from the 1700s, right? The Black Carib rulers or chiefs stand before British soldiers. This is in St. Vincent too, supposedly. The people we're kind of talking about, so you can have a reference. All right, Caribs at home preparing cassava according to primitive methods, St. Vincent, as you guys can see. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Pura vida, mi gente, come through, get cozy. Welcome. Big up the Garifuna people, D. Blake, yeah. Big up. All right. So a lot of the so-called Black Caribs from St. Vincent ended up in Central America. Um, Let me just go ahead and so Garifuna is like in Honduras, there were a lot of them are there, and the other islands on the coast, Nicaragua, Guatemala. Yeah, a lot of the ancestry goes back to St. Vincent, and a lot of these people, what you refer to as Garifuna. And I recently just went to as you guys can see here, Walaba, Puerto Viejo. This is in Costa Rica. They had the same clothing. They had carnivals dressed in the same way, traditional way. So it's not like, oh, that's an African thing. That's why they're dressing like. No, that doesn't mean that. But so just wanted you guys to see. Okay, general history, right? Before we get into our book. A people of mixed, free African, Amerindian, free African, huh? Free Africans, huh? What African? So let's see the complete genealogy. Let's prove the African part. Amerindian for sure. Ancestry origin in the Caribbean island of St. Vincent and traditionally speak Garifuna and Arawakan language. So remember how just the other day we were doing the video, the legal Indian slave trade of the Caribbean, right? That I did the other day, and how they were enslaving a lot of the so-called Black Caribs or Caribs who were actually Arawak people, but there's a lot of these people from the Lesser Antilles, which St. Vincent is part of, were labeled Caribs. A lot of them are Arawakan. And again, the enslavement, I just went over this, right? The reclassification of brown peoples the other day, 6 days ago. We know Gustavo Vasa's stories, the whole lie. He's from Barbados or South Carolina, most likely, right? We went live part one with this article the other day, Ethnogenesis and Ethnohistory of the Garifuna Carib Culture, History on St. Vincent, the Lesser Antilles. So that's almost 2 hours long, which we got like the first parts of the book we're going to get into today, where we're going to pick off. So make sure to catch those. Yeah, all this stuff, like the local trade is all recorded. We have shown it. That's just what I'm saying. Make sure to catch my Real Slave Trade of America playlist. Now podcast, part of the podcast. Talking to the YouTube partners that said, hey, you should just make it a podcast, like it'll come up on YouTube Music. I'm like, oh, okay. So make sure to check out the playlist if you're just new to the channel. All right. You can watch all the associated videos also in it. You get a better understanding of true American servitude or slavery, right? Who was involved, the people, who's going through real middle passages, all that. All right. This is not about emotions, it's about facts. Gotta correct the narratives. All right. And it gotta have context when telling the story. Even though we read in a lot of modern articles, right? A lot of modern articles, a lot of them influenced by the whole out of Africa stuff. We know how to dodge the hijack. We pull out the babies, but we understand the true history because there's a lot of there's 8 years behind us. 8 years behind us of research. A lot of research actually of the Americas in general and its people and a lot of factual history and genealogy, primary sources, ethnology, anthropology, archaeology, philology. All right, so I welcome you to go ahead and get caught up on the videos if you can, if you're new, especially with the playlist, The Real Slave Trade. Check it out, it's on the playlist tab of the main page. If you go to the main page, there's tabs over here, live videos, regular videos, playlists. You'll see all the playlists that I have organized for you, just in case you want to get caught up in certain things, certain topics. Okay, let's get the book out right here. So we're going to get into again the book Sojourners of the Caribbean, Ethnogenesis and Ethnohistory of the Garifuna. Oh, the ologies for real. This is by Nancy L. Gonzalez. Shout out to Nancy for the hard work and the investigation and the written text here that we can read from the University of Illinois Press. This is from like 1988, it says here. Board of Trustees. It could be older too. Well, it says she was 1929. Book is printed as a free paper, Library of Congress. So yeah, that might be that old. So we're gonna get into another part of this article where we're going to, I guess, chapter 2 in this book, the Deportation of 1797. And it says, it is clear that the forced departure of Black Caribs from St. Vincent and Balisux, remember that's an island of part of St. Vincent too, a little smaller island, brought about a major change in their way of living, as well as in the symbols of which Carib ethnicity was manifested and perceived, both among themselves and by outsiders. This chapter describes the impact of the deportation upon the Carib sense of peoplehood and continues the exploration of the extent to which they might have constituted a political entity both before and after their capture and banishment. After leaving Balisux, the convoy stopped at Bequia and Grenada to load supplies, troops, and perhaps more prisoners. It then headed directly for Jamaica, where there was a layover of 18 days, while more supplies were loaded and repairs made on the Experiment, as well as on the John and Mary, which had sprung a leak. It is not clear if the latter ship continued on to Roatan, or if its cargo and prisoners were redistributed among other ships. Remember, Roatan is an island off the coast of Central America, like very close to Honduras and Belize. There are frequent references to sickness among the passengers and troops. It says the landing at Roatan and the siege of Trujillo. On April 11, 1797, the convoy arrived at Roatan, where they found a small Spanish fort and garrison, whose commandant quickly accepted the English terms of surrender. Obviously, the appearance of such a large fleet, 8 to 10 ships, suggested surrender as the most prudent course of action. The next day, Captain Barrett recorded in his log that the Caribs were landed at Port Royal on the southeastern coast of Roatan, along with various supplies. That same day, they learned that the Prince William Henry, carrying some 300 Caribs, had been captured by the Spanish near the island of Guanaja, another of the Bay Islands east of Roatan. Even though many of the sailors and troops were still sick, Captain Barrett ordered 3 of his ships, including an American brig that had been impressed on the high seas, to Trujillo. He was determined to exchange his new prisoners for the Caribs. All right. Exchange for what? As slaves, man. They're not really saying it, but they're still in the 1700s here, right? So, this table real quick says supplies provided by the British for the use of the black Caribs on Roatan. All right, so you guys can see saltfish, right? Saltfish, just like what they make ackee with, ackee and saltfish, right? In the Caribbean. And a lot of saltfish dishes. And everything else, you guys see? Says the modern military man or woman would be astonished to read the accounts of the action that followed. The official reports by eyewitnesses differ in such details as the date, time of attack, number of casualties, and even the outcome. Both the English and the Spanish claimed victory, the latter offering a Thanksgiving Mass a few days later. Most Spanish accounts failed to mention the capture of the Caribs as an issue in the attack, attributing it merely to English piracy. You see, blame the pirates. Oh, they the ones who captured them. They failed to mention the capture of the Caribs. Listen, now they just not calling them black Caribs, they just calling them Caribs, right? Attributing it merely to English piracy, even though Spain and England were officially at war at the time. The English, however, though formidable on the seas, could not match the tactics of the Spanish on the mainland. Upon heavy bombardment from the 3 English ships, the Spanish simply withdrew from Trujillo, leaving behind a small hidden intelligence force. When the English, assuming victory, swooped in to sack the houses, the Spanish, lying in wait a short distance away, fell upon them. The English attributed their subsequent inability to take the town of the Spanish, having brought reinforcements from some interior posts. According to the Spanish, however, the town was nearly lost, and indeed might have been had the English not seen so intent upon seizing booty, and had the Spanish not freed prisoners in the local jail and called upon those hospitalized to help defend the plaza. No other reinforcements seemed to have been available. At least one source attributed the victory to the fighting skills of a company of French Negroes. A company of what? A company of French Negroes. All right. Okay. French Negroes. Black Europeans. Recently arrived from Santo Domingo, whence they had been exiled. You guys see that? What's up, family? Welcome. In any case, the English finally succeeded in retrieving the Prince William Henry, along with its Carib passengers, and started back to Roatan on April 29. On the way, they sighted several enemy ships, and to avoid an unwanted encounter, Captain Barrett instructed the entire convoy to set sail immediately for Nova Scotia. All the way to Nova Scotia, huh? The Prince William Henry, with the Caribs on board, was simply abandoned. Shortly thereafter, it crashed on the reefs and sank. Oh, man. That's my sub right there. Quoting a British naval captain familiar with the Bay Islands said, generally speaking, these harbors are surrounded by reefs of coral. Their channels are narrow and ought never to be attempted by strangers. Several accounts given to me by Garifuna elders suggest that many persons drowned in this mishap. That's messed up. They drowned a lot of the Caribs because they tried to go through that area where they hit coral, these ships. What fate then befell these black Caribs? Exiled from the only homeland they had ever known. A visitor to the area in 1802 predicted, Their total extinction is near at hand. All right, so 1802. This is why I want to just again remind everybody, right? We're talking about 1802. And the other day, again, we just did the other video, reminded you. Again, go check out this series, The Real Slave Trade. You're going to see part one. A lot of people getting taken from there on the Lesser Antilles. And then just recently, again, you watch this video, the legal Indian slave trade, how many, they was already depopulating all these islands way before the 1800s, where they just told us, way before. So make sure to check out that video. You got to have context. You got to see how it's been going on, even up to the 1800s. They're saying, oh, now in the 1802, their total extinction is near at hand. By 1800s, of course, by 1800, they were enslaving them since the 1500s, 1490s, since they got there. Since they got there, guys, 1490s, 1500s, a lot. You guys saw that whole video was about the 1500s. Taking them to Hispaniola, taking them to Central America, South America, taking them to Spain, West Africa. So by the 1802, now they're saying their extinction is near at hand. Extinction, huh? Reclassification, paper genocide, murder, relocation. As we know, this was far from accurate, but the future must have seemed perilous for the survivors at that point. Many were ill, most had lost close relatives and loved ones. They were far from familiar territory, and the supplies left for them were inadequate and in poor condition. The British clearly expected the Caribs to recreate a lifestyle similar to the one they had left behind, to be based on agriculture, fishing, and mercenary soldiering. They were mercenaries at some point, for the Europeans. Plus odds bits of trading and wage labor. An intriguing reference in the British Honduran archive shows that the Belizeans intended to turn the famed military prowess of the Caribs to their own advantage against the Spanish. Not only did the British leave muskets and ammunition behind on Roatan, but military uniforms awaited the Caribs, anticipated arrival in Belize City. Once it had learned that the Caribs had defected to the Spanish, the uniforms were issued instead to slaves commandeered to defend the settlement at Belize. All the British plans went awry. However, because the Caribs did not colonize Roatan, and the military skills were quickly recognized and utilized by the Spaniards in Trujillo, how, when, and why did they leave Roatan? This question has been pondered by modern Garifuna as well as by historians and anthropologists. Why did they leave Roatan? Which is like almost like a Maya word, Roatan. The trouble with Roatan. Visage has recorded oral traditions from Honduras which assert that the Caribs left Roatan because there were no cohun, atalea cohun, mart, or palm trees there, whose fronts were needed to roof their houses. Here we have an example of oral tradition that is of little help. See, of little help. This oral tradition, like, had to be a bit more better reason than that. And it seems a bit odd that the story should have been believed by a serious student of culture. Lack of cohun seems an unlikely reason for leaving the island on several grounds. First, palm trees of various sorts suitable for roofing undoubtedly grew on the island, since they were mentioned as being common only a few years earlier. On Dominica, Hodge reported that modern Caribs were using thatchings of jatahu, Ritocas amara, which suggests that alternative thatching was either known or easily adopted. Second, housing was not the Caribs' most immediate need. Both English and Spanish accounts mention that those who stayed on the southern shore of Roatan found shelter in the military barracks or other structures already there. Finally, it seems that only a week or two after arrival, 3 Carib men found their way to Trujillo to petition to Spanish to liberate them from the island. Obviously, at least some of the new arrivals were eager to leave at once. Perhaps they thought they might be able to find a way to return to St. Vincent. although they surely understood enough about navigation to know how far away that was. More likely, the political acumen they had achieved over the past few generations suggested that negotiation with these new Europeans might improve their chances of survival. Those captured aboard the Prince William Henry, again captured, having spent several days in the harbor at Trujillo, may have suggested this move. Indeed, some of them may have landed and observed the presence of other French-speaking blacks in that port. At least two Caribs had accompanied the British ships sent to Trujillo to negotiate an exchange of prisoners. In fact, they may have been the emissaries to whom Perez Brito referred. There is no evidence that the Caribs arrived on the mainland in large numbers until October 1797, when a census was made of them in Trujillo. Oral traditions recorded by me and other ethnographers say that the people arrived on the mainland on rafts. A few may have done so, but the available historical evidence does not confirm the point. In fact, Major Wilson reported that they were busily clearing land when the convoy left. This could well have been primarily, and was certainly incidentally, intended to secure trees for rafts and or dugout canoes. The transport of many hundreds of persons, however, would have required more canoes and or rafts that they could have found or quickly manufactured. Thus, help was sought from the Europeans with their larger schooners and brigantines. Don Jose Rossi and Ruby, to whom the Caribs formally surrendered, on May 19, 1797, was besieged by men and women, all of whom wanted to go immediately to the mainland with him. He apparently accommodated some and promised to return soon for the others, although there is no direct evidence that he or anyone else did so until October. We now know when or how, but why did the Caribs desert an island that literally had been handed to them as their own? Why did they not settle in, planting the seeds and cuttings left for them, fishing and gradually exploring the possibilities on the mainland for trade and or work? The answer seems to lie in the nature of the island itself, in the dearth of foodstuff available to them, and in the international and local political situation in which the Caribs were only a pawn. Were only a pawn. So real quick, since we're live, guys, right? Let's go to maps real quick. Let's go to maps. Let's see if it comes up. So just so you guys, just so we can see. Roatan, Honduras, right? Let's see. So Roatan Island. You guys see that? Roatan. So it's like, look, Trujillo, we just read about, right? Trujillo right here. Trujillo in 1700s, right? That's where they were heading to. Trujillo from the island, Roatan Islands, right? Right here. And again, where were they coming from? St. Vincent, right? St. Vincent right here. St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Look at that. All right. And a lot of these different islands too, they were coming from, sending them to all these islands. And then up in South America, a lot of them. Then they're mixing already, mixing with the local indigenous people. And we can't leave it out, guys. The Black Europeans. A lot of Black European too in there, mixing in with all these people. Right, so that's just the island. That's what I wanted to show. Nice little place right here, actually. You see that? You got, I guess, some cruise ships going there. So I guess they didn't, they wanted to get out of there. I guess, I guess they were saying they were just pawns in a game. They were just all being thrown in that little island right there. Right, and they didn't, they didn't find it useful to them, But it's a nice place. Look at that. Nice place now, modern times, right? Nice little place. Beautiful little place, actually. Yeah. All right, so let's go back to the book. They were only a pawn, though. There is little agreement even today as to the fertility of Roatan soils. some extolling their virtues, others decrying their sterility. But the southeastern portion of the island where the Caribs were landed is today pine covered with red sandy, rather uninviting soil, and it was probably not much different in the later 18th century. The northern side of the island is somewhat better, and it is significant that Rosie and Ruby first landed there at a place then called the Huerta del Rey, the King's Garden, a name that suggests some planting had already been done there by others. Indeed, there is evidence that a few blacks, former slaves of the British on the mainland, may have settled there in 1786. A 105-year-old Garifuna woman on Roatan told me in 1984, she was 105, Black Carib, that her grandmother always said the first Caribs had gone to what is now called Camp Bay, although only non-Carib blacks live there now. Huh, non-Carib blacks, huh? Now they're so-called blacks, you mean? Today, this place can be reached on foot from Port Royal in less than 2 hours, and seems possible that some of the first Caribs, in exploring the island, thought this to be a more favorable spot for settlement. They may also have found other black people there, other so-called black crayon-colored people. Water was and is a problem on the southern side of the island, since the few small streams from the hilly interior flow north. In April, it is likely that even these streams would have been mere trickles until the rains began again sometime around the middle of September. As I have suggested elsewhere, clearing and planting fields sufficient to feed some 1,800 people would have been difficult, even if the people had otherwise been in good health and had viable seeds and cuttings. With insufficient rainfall, a harvest would have been impossible. Major Wilson, in a desperate plea to his superiors, requested that another boatload of supplies be sent from England to sustain the Caribs until they might achieve a harvest. All right, so now they got to be helped because they couldn't even grow. That's, a lot of those reasons they didn't want to be in Roatan Island. They want to go to the mainland. So this table right here says request for extra supplies. All right, so this is what they asked for them. Indian corn, man. They could have grew that themselves. Look, salt beef, saltfish, flour, tobacco, okra. They need their tobacco too, They got to smoke. Plantains, get them their tobacco, man, so they can be happy. It says 5, he mentioned that many of the casada cuttings had been water soaked and probably would not germinate. Let us assume, however, that some agriculture would have been possible, especially on the northern side of the island, where today we find the Garifuna town of Punta Gorda, as well as other villages composed of non-Garifuna. Could they have survived until their first harvest? Table 2.1 shows the amounts of food, tools, and other supplies said to have been shipped and landed by the British for the use of the Caribs. The flour was most likely wheat, but it might have been mixed with barley and rye, since the 1795-96 harvest in England had been usually poor and near famine conditions prevailed there. The price of wheat doubled that year in England, and there were attempts at home to get people to substitute barley, rye, potatoes, and rice for the very scarce wheat, without much success at first. So they had their own problems in Europe, right? In any case, the amount of flour provided along with the biscuit, also presumably of wheat, was actually quite generous for the time. The farin was probably cassava meal, an indigenous Carib food. But there were only about 6 pounds per person. There were nearly 10 pounds per person of tazo, from Spanish tasajo, or dried jerked meat, in addition to a small amount of fresh beef and about 23 pounds per person of salt fish. To calculate just what these supplies might have meant for the maintenance of the people left on the island, we can compare the quantities with those allowed as seamen's rations at the time. Fresh beef was the primary protein mainstay of the Navy, it being customary to carry live animals on board to be butchered as needed. The allowance was from 4 to 7 pounds per man per week, depending on whether salt pork and or salt fish were also available. Salt fish was of lower status and more generally the food for slaves. They keep saying salt fish is the food of slaves, or was, although sometimes it was fed to sailors. 1/2 pound per person per day was considered sufficient. Dundas in 1796 mentioned 1 pound of beef, 2 pounds of wheat flour, and 2 pounds of potatoes per man per day as a normal ration or ration. Lewis has stated that naval men in 1808 received the following per week: 6 pounds of beef and or pork, 7 pounds of biscuit, 2 pints of peas, 1 and 1/2 pints of oatmeal, 6 ounces of sugar, 6 ounces of butter, and 12 ounces of cheese. All right. The supplies landed for the Caribs show the biggest discrepancies between beef loaded and landed for additional supplies of dressed meat and live bullocks had been boarded at Jamaica. Large quantities of beef were used during the journey to feed the company, especially the sick, since beef was considered highly nourishing. The captain repeatedly noted that he had sent beef to the hospital ships for this purpose. During the journey, the original amount of saltfish was reduced by more than half, though a goodly amount remained, perhaps because this was less palatable of the British than beef. To the British, right? Apparently, the convoy went off to Nova Scotia with much of what remained of the other supplies, putting the needs of the sick troops ahead of those of the Caribs. In further considering the discrepancies between the amounts of other foods boarded and landed, we must also remember that much food had been used on the journey, which was prolonged beyond expectations by the lengthy stopover in Jamaica and by the siege of Trujillo. Furthermore, on March 20th, Captain Barrett had condemned nearly 10,000 pounds of bread, 736 pounds of flour, and 567 pounds of sugar, presumably because they had been water damaged, and it is entirely reasonable to assume that other supplies suffered the same fate. Finally, of course, one or both lists may have been an error, either by accident or design. Using these rough guidelines, we can calculate how long the supplies landed would last if there had been 1,800 Caribs, not adjusting for sex or age. The flour would have been enough for about 40 days. The beef and saltfish together about 12 to 15 days, and the biscuits about 24 days. The sugar amounted to about a pound per person, and the cocoa about 1/2 pound per person total. If only the men drank the rum, they would have been about 1 cup each, hardly enough to help them forget their troubles, much less get drunk. Although the foods provided were not exactly what the Caribs were accustomed to, they were not faced with immediate starvation, as has sometimes been suggested in the oral traditions. Undoubtedly, they were able to do some fishing, since hooks and lines were provided, and since it appears that they either made or found a few canoes in a fairly short time. It is also clear, however, that they would have been unable to survive until they could abstain or obtain a harvest. Probably they even ate their seed corn, which might not have germinated anyway. As experienced cultivators, they must have realized too that the soils of Roatan, even at the Huerta del Rey, were not comparable to those of St. Vincent. Rubio Sanchez mentions that the Spanish colonists on Roatan in 1791 found agriculture difficult because of arid conditions and depredations by wild animals. Finally, having arrived on the island during the driest season of the year, they may have suffered from lack of water, and without knowing the time of the onset of rains in this part of the world, they may have despaired and rejected planting altogether. And it continues saying the politics of survival. A still more satisfactory explanation for the Black Caribs' abandonment of Roatan requires consideration of social-political factors, including those at the international or state level, as well as those deriving from the recent St. Vincent events. As we have seen in Chapter 1, there appears to have been a rudimentary chiefdom type of organization on St. Vincent, and in spite of massive losses through warfare, disease, malnourishment before and after leaving the island, and drowning, the system seems to have survived the deportation. The censuses taken by the Spanish upon the Caribs' arrival in Trujillo list every person by name, sex, age, religious preference, and what we call political affiliation. Example, membership in a company, headed by what the Spanish called captains. As suggested in the previous chapter, these were apparently the same leaders called chiefs by the British on St. Vincent. The Spanish list named each ledger along with the number of his followers. Leadership at that time seems to have involved a certain amount of authority to make decisions, although it is also apparent that this authority was not absolute, since several references suggest that the people sometimes rebelled murmuring, or more likely shouting down decisions they did not approve. Anderson noted that the older Chatoyed authorities derived from his advanced age, which gave him more information than many other members of his group. This reasonable and anthropologically satisfying comment fits better with what we know of such societies that does not, sorry, that than does the notion, of 12-year-old heir wielding authority, merely because of his dead father's position. Still, some respect clearly attached to the kinship unit itself and filiation in a society that emphasizes the continuity of life after death and control of the affairs of the living from the afterworld, might have given the son some degree of access to his father's power. Contrary to what was assumed at the time by the British, and sometimes since then by both Garifuna and Garifuna scholars, there was no single overall political organization among Caribs on St. Vincent. Hadel has recorded an oral tradition from beliefs that there had been two endogamous factions and that they had persisted for 100 years after arriving in Central America. One was supposedly called Asira Gena or Asira Hena, and the other Uri. Each had its own chief, and they made frequent night raids on each other, taking captives, robbing and destroying each other's crops. This sounds suspiciously like Yellow versus Black Caribs, each with a paramount chief. The story also coincides with early descriptions of dual organization on other islands inhabited by island Caribs. Even if there had been such political organization, it seems not to have persisted in Central America. The only hint of a binary division there is in reference to the partisans of the French versus those of the British. It is clear from Spanish accounts that some of the blacks they encountered on Roatan spoke some English and considered themselves to be friendly to the British rather than the French. But even if the people disagreed on foreign policy, there is no evidence that there were two groups that went so far as to damage each other's lives and livelihood, or that such a division underlay any of the settlement decisions in Central America. None of my informants in Guatemala or Honduras can explain Hadel's informant's comments, nor do such comments accord with the documentary evidence I have seen. Rather, there seem to have been numerous residentially separate groups headed by hereditary leaders on St. Vincent. In 1796, these chiefs or captains surrendered or were captured along with their people at different times and in different places. This organization into smaller groups survived Balisuk's and the deportation. It may have been crucial in determining the Black Caribs' eventual Central American mainland settlement patterns. By the time they reached Roatan, however, whatever disagreements or different loyalties the various groups may have had on St. Vincent seem to have been submerged in favor of a more pan-Carib perspective. The following entry from Rosie and Ruby's diary, made shortly after his encounter with one of the leaders who was said to have spoken in English, illustrates this point. I do not command in the name of anyone. I am not English, nor French, nor Spanish, nor do I care to be any of these. I am a Carib subordinate to no one. I do not care to be more or to have more than I have. And they wrote that in the Gaceta de Guatemala, the Guatemala Gazette from June 26, 1797. Okay? Had the Black Caribs stayed on Roatan, they would have been limited to desultory subsistence agriculture and an unhospitable environment. Breaking into smaller traditional residential groups would not have improved their lot much, for they would have had little to live on, no houses and no jobs, other than strategic location of the island, which made it a valuable prize for any seafaring nation. Roatan was not inherently rich, yet the British clearly intended that the Caribs defend the island against the Spanish, if necessary. What the Caribs saw of the two European powers on April 25, So April 26, 1797 may have convinced them to throw in their lot, at least momentarily, with the Spanish. When they arrived in Trujillo, the commandante of the military post noted with surprise and pleasure that most of the men and many of the boys were capable of bearing arms and had some familiarity with their use. They were immediately absorbed into the local militia, thus assuring their people's survival over the short run at least. All right, you hearing this? Assimilating. As we shall see in the next chapter, the Black Caribs alliance with these new Euro-Americans who call themselves Spaniards in parentheses, right? Who are these Black Europeans, huh? Did not prevent them from seeking employment and trading partners with all the various populations on the Caribbean coast of Central America, from Cape Gracias a Dios to Belize City, from Gracias a Dios all the way down in Panama to Belize. In fact, Gracias a Dios in Nicaragua, I think. Yeah, Nicaragua. Within a generation, they had made this largely their territory, driving the Mosquito Indians, or they call them Sambos, colored folks, huh, to the east and eventually threatening the latter's hold in what is now Nicaragua. So these Black Caribs being forced to relocate, they themselves going there and kind of doing the same to the Mosquito people. And then the Mosquito people doing the same to other tribes in Central America. Like we got the whole drop, like it was a thing, it's the survival of the fittest. So the time on Roatan was a temporary and unhappy lull in the Carib journey. Although some may have stayed behind to found the northern village of Punta Gorda, neither oral tradition nor documentary history nor archaeological evidence support that view. Rather, it appears that all those who had survived so far ventured to the mainland to seek their fortunes. Oral tradition sometimes suggests that the winds blew their small craft here and there on the crossing to the Central American mainland. Chapter 3 presents the alternate explanations for their scattered settlement patterns. All right, and so that was like, I guess, chapter 2. So we're gonna go on to chapter 3 if you guys don't mind. All right, chapter 3. It says here the Central American settlement, 1800 to 1900. This is very recent events, right? So remember the whole history before this. What's going on in the Caribbean with the indigenous people, the Europeans who are coming, what's going on too with them, all that. Don't leave all that out. I gotta have context. But again, we're talking about these people's specific history, right? So we're just going and, shout out to the author again, Nicole. Sojourners of the Caribbean, Ethnogenesis and Ethnohistory of the Garifuna. That's the name of the book. We're in chapter 3, Central American Settlement, 1800 and 1900. It says Anglo-Hispanic competition for hegemony. Upon arrival in Trujillo, the nearly 1,700 Black Caribs, who we talking about, okay, were quickly settled. Local opinions vary as to where their first houses were built, but most people believe they were divided between what is now the barrio Rio Negro, on the east of the barrio Cristales, near the river of the same name on the western edge of the town. The Garifuna name for the former, Garibal, place where Caribs live, suggests its primacy. They also were said to have lived on the slopes and crests of the hills behind Trujillo in 1804. So some Caribs must have settled inland, perhaps replicating the patterns described for them on St. Vincent. Settling such a large group must have posed logistical difficulties, since Trujillo had not been so heavily populated in some time. The town was one of the earliest Spanish settlements in Central America. Remember, we just showed you Trujillo on the map, right? Where's that located? One of the first settlements in Central America, by the way, having been founded in 1502. Founded. Key word right here, all right? Key word right here. They found it, right? They found it. They found it. Found it. They found this town was already there. This old world buildings were already there. They found the town of Trujillo, the indigenous towns. They found these towns. Guys get it? All the mud flood researchers, old world. Come on, you guys know what I'm talking about. They found the town in 1502, Trujillo, and had been repeatedly sacked by pirates. The cryptos, the crypto Jews and crypto Moors. The port was officially abandoned after the Dutch demolished it in 1643. Some sort of settlement apparently remained, however, to be mercilessly ravished again and again, and by the English in 1645 and 1688, and by the English and French in 1772. The fort was rebuilt in 1780, but Trujillo remained vulnerable to attack well into the 20th century. One source states that the British made their initial appearance in Central America during the time of Henry VIII, trading logwood from Belize in the early 16th century. If so, it took them more than 100 years to regularize their presence, a concession from Spain finally having been granted in 1667 by the Treaty of Utrecht. Meanwhile, Cape Gracias a Dios was settled in 1634 by colonists from Providence Island. From Providence Island, huh? Which actually had a lot of Pequot Indians from New England. You guys remember, right? This is what I'm saying. Remember, all the research we've done is still in the same time frame, 1634, when they had to leave Providence Island. Not only them, but the people who had them, all of them. And now they're going to go after the local people. This is in Nicaragua, Cape Gracias a Dios. And then up in Nicaragua, this is part of our video right here, guys. You guys remember, right? If not, go check out the video, guys. The Pequot Indians got and sent and called Negro, cannibal Negroes, they were called in the records, and sent to Providence Island, which is not too far from Costa Rica, Nicaragua, right? And from these two places, the British gradually spread to some 16 other locations in what are now Nicaragua and Honduras, including a settlement in 1742 at Roatan, all right? So along with a lot of the Indians, like the Pecos, the English, so-called English, right? All these people, so-called colonists. Probably the best known and certainly the largest of these settlements was at Black River, or La Cibra, or Criba, as it is sometimes known even today. Although its official Spanish name has always been Rio Tinto, or the tainted river, colored river, right? River, or Black River, huh? Using both slave and free labor, the British planted sugarcane and raised cattle. So-called British with the sugarcane, that was the cryptos. And raised cattle, they also cut wood and collected sarsaparilla, tiger, ocelot, or jaguars, and deer skins, gums, and other forest products for export to Europe. They're killing our jaguars. In the earliest days, they initiated the slave trade. Okay, listen, this is what I'm saying. We got the whole video on this. In the early days, they initiated a slave trade with the Mosquito Indians, who enriched themselves by raiding interior groups and selling captives to the British, like I was just saying earlier. The Mosquito Indians helped a lot of the so-called English, when they arrived in these areas, to enslave other Indians that were more interior in Central America, in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras. They were going and slave raiding. This happened for a long time. The Mosquito Indians helped the so-called British. One of the Mosquito princes, or the chiefs, right, the sons of one of the chiefs, was able to go to England and everything in the 1600s. We got the whole drop on my videos. Okay, this is what I want you guys to understand. So with these English came the Pequots and all these other people they had as slaves too. All the way from New England and all the way to Providence Island and all the way into Central America, the Pequots, went on. A lot of people don't know that. So this slave raiding, the slave trade that the Mosquito Indians literally were helping the British with. They were slaving Indians, right? American Indians. Here we go again. We're not doing a slavery video, but this is what I'm trying to tell you. All these official, specific little stories, and we start going into the specific people, you see who they were really enslaving. They weren't going to Africa. This commerce established a long-standing relationship. Long-standing. that benefited both the Mosquitoes and the British in many ways, all right? The slave trade they created of American Indians. Though in the long run, it proved a dead end for both. One of the most important advantages for the British in the 17th and 18th centuries was in providing a loyal local militia. The Mosquitoes sold forest products to the British, provided them with fish and game, and facilitated their considerable contraband trade with the Spanish Creoles in the highlands. With who? The Spanish Creoles. They have a lot of Indian in these and these so-called Spanish Creoles in the that live in the highlands now. Yeah, whenever you see Creoles, guys, there's a lot of American Indian there in there mixed in. As part of their system of indirect rule, the British supplied the Mosquitoes with arms and ammunition and created a Mosquito monarchy patterned somewhat after their own, in which each succeeding hereditary king was ceremoniously crowned by the British king's representative. So you see, this is what I'm saying. They wanted their sons became a king. This is why he was a prince, and he ended up going to England to meet their royals. No, I wasn't making this up. So again, and which each succeeding hereditary king was ceremoniously crowned by the British king's representative, either in Jamaica or in Belize. Subordinate leaders assumed titles such as governor, admiral, general, and at the local level, captain. Remnants of this kingship remain until the 20th century. And to this day, the Mosquitoes express a nostalgia for the good old days, right? The good old days when they were the ones hunting other Indians to sell out to the British. The good old days, huh? Of British domination, claiming to prefer English speakers to the Spanish among whom they now live. With the help of the Mosquito, the coastal area of Central America remained in British control for about 150 years. Although there was continual harassment by the Spanish, routed from the Mosquito shore in 1730 and again in 1754, the British were forced to flee to Roatan in 1763 when the Treaty of Paris was signed in Europe. They returned soon after, however, only to be ignominiously forced out again in 1779 and sent as prisoners to Merida and Havana. The Treaty of Versailles in 1783 was the final blow for them, especially its 1786 sequel, the Convention of London, in which the British Crown sacrificed the Mosquito Shore and Bay Islands for expanded concessions in Belize and on Gibraltar. At that time, the shore settlers were instructed to relocate to Belize, where they were given land for themselves and their slaves. Many refused to leave, however, until the Spanish used force against them in 1787. Some then fled to Roatan but were pursued and expelled by Spanish forces, only a small number of their former slaves being allowed to remain. When the Caribs arrived in Trujillo in 1797, there were already in the vicinity about 300 French Negroes. French Negroes, what do they mean by that, right? We can go so many ways with that, right? From Santo Domingo. An unspecified number of free colors, that could include many Indians, that could include Indians, right? Even Black Europeans, perhaps from Grenada, with some women and children. About 40 English, in parentheses, English blacks. Yeah, that's the hijack. This is what I'm saying. This ain't being specific to us. Former slaves of the British colonists. That doesn't mean they're African just because they're slaves. They could be indentured servants. And perhaps as many as 700 mestizos and whites. So remember, we broke down the other day on a video we had about loros, pardos, and mestizos and stuff. Well, how it was being used in context in those times. Anguiano referred to 300 English blacks as nearby Campamento in addition to the French blacks at Trujillo. According to Burden, a group of French had established themselves near Trujillo in 1796, but it is not clear if these were the same blacks described by Hodaili. Some may have been white refugees from San Domingo, now Haiti. White refugees, huh? So-called white refugees, white slaves, huh? Or other French colonies who would have brought some slaves with them. Lands were granted to several of these individuals, including at least one marquis who settled at Punta Quemar or Quemada, today Punta Betulia, near Trujillo. Some of the earliest black Caribs settled there too, possibly to help work his lands. Other so-called whites or Europeans included nearly 500 Spanish colonists from the Canaries, Galicia, and Asturias, brought over in 1787 and 88 and settled at Roatan, Cape Gracias a Dios, Black River, and Trujillo. A total of 1,298 settlers arrived, although there was heavy mortality among them during the first years, and they were not successful in their agricultural endeavors. Starving and harassed by hostile mosquitoes, most of the settlers soon abandoned their area. The survivors flocked into Trujillo, with only a handful remaining at Roatan. So look at all these people ending up in Trujillo with the Black Caribs. So what happened to all these people? And they mix with all these people probably eventually mixing, assimilating together. The influx of Caribs was a godsend in terms of their labor potential, but they soon began to be perceived as a threat to the security of Trujillo and the shore. They were not only black and foreign, but were thought by the Spanish, with some good reason, to be likely to align themselves with the Mosquito and the English. In 1804, Ramon Anguiano, the governor of Comayagua, reflected the near panic of some officials when he advised the immediate removal of all blacks from the coast of Honduras. Wow. All so-called blacks, crayon colors. Anybody who's now everybody's being grouped together. Look what they're doing though. Not creating a division by color. Before their numbers increased to the point where that would become impossible. The Caribs at Trujillo reportedly numbered 4,000, which seems impossible even if we concede a high initial fertility. The figure probably included some or all of the various other blacks in the area. No, that was all the black Caribs. They can't believe the numbers. Like, well, they don't look like Indians. That's all like, damn, that's a lot of them. Gotta be some other blacks. What other blacks? Those other blacks could be Indians too, right? Or Europeans. Even though they recognized that there were different social cultural groups present, their confusion is evidenced not only in the 1804 reports, but in other ways over the years, even to the present time. Governor Anguiano's concern is evidence that the British strategy of dumping rebellious and rebellious or Republican blacks in Spanish territories had in fact some of the effects intended. In the long run, however, the black immigration seems to have benefited rather than endangered the Spanish position. So who are these Republican blacks? From where are they grabbing these so-called Republican blacks? And listen, they're saying they're telling you right here, they're dumping them along with their slaves and the Indians and the black guys and these places in Central America. Now all the blacks are coming together. Now there's too many blacks now. They want to get rid of all of them now. So-called blacks. The governor's recommendation was to return all blacks to the French colonies, whence they supposedly had come, or else to the French Republic itself. By 1813, however, Anguianos had modified his stance, clearly revealing his ambivalence toward the newcomers, suggesting that a few be retained at Trujillo, but the majority be encouraged to settle in the interior of Honduras or along the various rivers of Mosquitia. Almost from the beginning, the Caribs began to make themselves known, building a reputation for intelligence, independence, fierceness, and hard work. On May 14, 1799, some 100 Caribs, proclaiming their hatred of the British, helped defend Trujillo against two ships of that nation. By 1802, though perhaps as early as 1799, some Caribs were journeying to Belize to seek work in the British woodworks and to bring back contraband goods for sale in Honduras. In 1804, some Caribs encountered off Trujillo by officers of the British sloop Snake Downs declared their hatred of the Spanish. At about the same time, they were complaining to the Spanish that they disliked being sent against the British, who seemed friendly to them. Instructions were sent from Jamaica to the superintendent at Belize to do all he could to further friendly relations between the Caribs and the Mosquitoes, and to encourage the latter to attack Trujillo to liberate the Caribs or Charibs from their present situation. They're telling the Mosquitoes to help them to free them. We do not know exactly what happened next, but in 1807 the Caribs of Trujillo fled that town, joining the Mosquitoes at Patuca. In spite of this apparent fulfillment of Governor Anguiano's desire, local Spaniards pursued and brought the Caribs back. Though the evidence is that at least some stayed behind or soon returned to settle at various spots along what they today call the Costa Arriba. Clearly, some Caribs had been there earlier, for in 1804 Henderson encountered Caribs between Black River and Caratasca in the territory of General Robinson, a prominent Mosquito leader. General Robinson, that was his name, huh? Mosquito leader then living at Black River. What was the context within which these events occurred? First of all, the Spanish were extremely fearful, with good reason, that the British would capture permanently the entire coastline and adjoining lowlands of Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. The British presence in the bay and on the shore, compounded by the large number of slaves and free blacks associated with them, plus their alliance with the Mosquitoes, was formidable. Even after their settlements were abandoned, British naval superiority allowed them to harass the Spanish coastal settlements and conduct an enormously profitable contraband trade throughout the 1790s. Concomitantly, the Spanish colonists on the shore were not prospering. Sorsby describes the various problems they faced, including inept administration, their lack of preparedness of living in an isolated, difficult environment, and failure to win over the Mosquitoes. Food shortages were severe, little was produced locally, and supplies from Havana were unreliable, insufficient, and expensive. Finally, disease was a continual and serious threat for Europeans as well as for Indians and mestizos from the highland areas. The Baymen of Belize, all right, and we got a whole book on that I actually ordered, guys. The Baymen of Belize, and these were black folks, Scottish, English, Irish. Yeah. The Baymen of Belize, by contrast, lived in constant fear of invasion by Spanish forces from Yucatan and or Trujillo. Since the wood supply in the northern part of Belize was poor due to overcutting, new stands were sought and often illegally cut farther south in the neighborhood of the Rio Dulce and Lake Isabal, well beyond the river Sheboon, which limit had been only recently conceded by the Treaty of Versailles. The British were aware that these transgressions increased the justification for and thus the risk of Spanish attack, but the woodcutters ignored their government's admonitions. George Arthur, superintendent of the settlement in 1821, wrote to the Earl of Bath, "It is very difficult to convince the magistrates, all merchants, and the public of Honduras that they are amenable to any superior authority whatever. Certainly the recent independence of their near neighbors influenced their attitudes, but they had been growing more irascible for years. After 1807, when England abolished the slave trade, so-called abolished, the woodcutters faced a new dilemma. Slaves from the Caribbean area were suspected of being infected with revolutionary fervor. New, in parentheses, new ones from Africa, that's the hijack, what new ones, were impossible to obtain legally and were therefore very expensive. That's the hijack. They added that they have no, that part right there, they have no source for. That's according to, this is what I'm saying. They write these in modern times with that whole, right? Which ones are you talking about though? Belizean slave women were more fertile. The local Belizean slave women were more fertile than those elsewhere. But conditions were still so unfavorable that the slave population could not be sustained through natural means. The Mosquitoes and other lowland indigenous groups could not be persuaded to work, and highland Indians did not survive long on the coast. The labor shortage was further aggravated by the continual flight of slaves to Spanish territory, where the law permitted them to remain if they came seeking Christian, for example, Catholic baptism. Although this had been going on since the 16th century, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Spanish used deliberate enticements of slaves to undermine the British presence in Central America. Huh. Very recently, they started really doing that more. As a result, the Caribs were quickly but clandestinely hired and soon became skilled woodcutters and incomparable smugglers. Deep River and Stan Creek, now Dangriga, were occupied in 1799 or 1800, probably with their help. Although the Spanish and British states were repeatedly and nearly continuously at war at the turn of the century, there were brief periods during which they allied themselves in their even greater mutual fear of the French. Between 1806 and 1808, the Spanish crown aligned itself with Napoleon, a situation that changed again with the latter's invasion of Spain in 1808. This led to a nationalistic opposition to both the foreign invader and to their own monarchy. A new, more democratic constitution was adopted, which dismayed the royalists while inspiring those Creoles in America, the Creoles who already yearned for independence. In the same year, a treaty again united Spain and England renounced her intentions of liberating or conquering Spanish America. During the intensely anti-French years between 1803 and 1812, a series of measures was taken in Belize to prevent any blacks thought to have French connections from entering the settlement. Black French, Black French, huh? This included the Black Caribs, who were sometimes specifically cited as being dangerous. Even though their labor was greatly valued, most of them had French names, spoke that language, and were known to have sided with France during the struggles on St. Vincent. Furthermore, both the Spanish and the English had reason to suspect that the Caribs might not be completely loyal to either of them. Thus, on July 6, 1812, a fine of 50 pounds sterling was set for anyone who hired or employed in Belize any Carib or French or Free Spanish blacks. All right, you guys hear that? Discrimination going on. Still, in spite of both fears and injunctions, the Spanish royalists and the Belizean woodcutters apparently went right on hiring Caribs because they valued their work. After Napoleon's downfall in 1815, the Spanish fear of the French was replaced by their fear of colonial revolts, themselves inspired in part by the French Revolution and assisted by idealistic French adventurers. As the Spanish nation trembled and buckled under Fernando VII, who in 1820 reestablished the old repressive constitution, revolutionary activities in the various Central American provinces increased, and Caribs, along with escaped Belizean slaves, became the mainstay of the royalist armies. In 1812, Caribs made up the battalion of Olancho. Okay, listen to these American Indians fighting in these wars, right? And made up the battalion of Olancho, who fought under General Pedro Gutierrez in a campaign against insurgents. What insurgents? Located between Tegucigalpa and Masaya in Honduras. It was noted that the presence of the Caribs struck fear into the hearts of all, including other soldiers fighting for the royalist cause. In 1819, an all-Carib company, headed by Carib Colonel Pedro Gregorio, a Carib colonel called Pedro Gregorio, all right, manned the fort at San Felipe on the Rio Dulce in Guatemala. All right, we got Black Carib, Pedro Gregorio, a Black Carib, right? He got a European name. He was a colonel too. He was in Guatemala leading a whole troop. In 1820, when the French mercenary revolutionists already attacked Trujillo, it was largely Caribs who defended the town, two of them dying in the effort. Caribs also formed part of the permanent Spanish garrisons in Tegucigalpa. Talking about Indians here, guys, right? And mostly Indians, right? And in Guatemala, having declared their independence from Spain on September 15th, 1821, the Central American provinces, right? All the countries in Central America got their independence on the same day, guys. This is the day they're talking about, including Costa Rica. And we got it by mail. We didn't have to fight for it or anything like that. You know, our wars are different. But anyways, that's the same date. September 15th, 1821. Central American provinces were annexed to Mexico on January 5th, 1822. They soon realized this was probably not their best advantage, and by 1823, most of them were again in revolt. After many internal power struggles, Manuel José Arce became the first president of the Federation of Central American States in 1825. The Central American states were the countries you see today in Central America. They were states. Central America was a country, was a province, had its own currency. The capital was in Guatemala. If you guys didn't know, until that got, dismantled, and now every province or every state became its own country. It says he was overthrown in 1829 by Francisco Morazan, who shortly afterwards was elected president. The latter began a massive program of radical economic and social development, which included banishment of most of the Catholic monastic orders, encouragement of religious freedom, and foreign colonization. He was probably a crypto Jew. That's why he was against the Catholics. You see, you got to know the background, the context. Exploration of an interoceanic canal, fiscal modernization, and sweeping legal reforms. Throughout Morazan's presidency, which lasted until 1840, Arce and his followers, representing the elite Creole classes and the Catholic Church, attempted many counter-revolutions, and many which of the Caribs figured prominently as soldiers. They used the Caribs, right, the Catholics, unsophisticated in political philosophy, and like other of the undereducated and less affluent segments of the population, the Caribs were likely to be swayed by factors having little to do with the real or imagined future well-being of the state, all right? Just like people today who are soldiers fighting the wars of the corporations. This is deep what they just said. They were just now they just going with whoever, right? Wow. In other words, they fought for those who paid them well and regularly. Huh. Now it's all about the money, huh? Hatkins, who traveled in 1826, noted more than once they have proved dangerous for the Republican government. There is, however, another possible reason for their involvement in the counter-revolutions. In spite of the fact that many of the black Caribs were at least nominally Catholic upon arrival in Trujillo, the church paid little attention to them until 1813, when special missionaries were sent to Trujillo to tend to their souls. Because the church was, for the most part, a conservative force in the Honduran provincial world, the Caribs may have been moved by ideological as well as monetary values and resistant moves toward independence. Unfortunately, the records are silent on this issue. In early 1832, a series of incidents occurred that continue to be recounted both in history books and in Garifuna oral traditions, though in somewhat different detail. Three allied revolutionary armies simultaneously attacked the government forces of Francisco Morazan. One army was led by former President Arce in the interior, another by Colonel Vicente Dominguez at Trujillo, and the third by Ramon Guzman at Omoa. Caribs fought with all three forces, although in Trujillo they were also employed by Morazan, having been recruited by a government agent under false pretenses at Omoa, and then transported to the more eastern port. When the Caribs found themselves off Trujillo, facing their fellows who had helped Dominguez take that town without a shot, they refused to fight, and the government effort to retake the port was momentarily thwarted. At San Felipe in the Guatemalan Gulf of Dulce, where Caribs had been in charge of the fort, the revolutionary force quickly took over, leaving the Carib commander and troops as they were, 200 Morenos, all right? Again, we're just talking about black Caribs, 200 Morenos, at least some of whom must have been Caribs, participated in the capture of Omoa, above which the victors unfurled the Spanish flag, much to the ire of many patriotic Creoles, including those opposed to Morazan's government. Although much of the populace and even the British superintendent, at believed Arce and his sympathizers would win, Morazan's forces were eventually victorious in all locations, and the rebels were accused of high treason. Fearful for their lives, most of the Caribs residing in Central American territory, especially those in Trujillo, Omoa, Livingston, and San Felipe, fled to Belize. All right, they what? They went to Belize. Caribs, right? The merchants there having also quietly supported Arce's cause. In 1834, Garcia Granados found only 2 or 3 Carib families in Livingston. Some Caribs remained abroad permanently, joining others already well ensconced at so-called Carib Town, Stan Creek, now Dandriga, and at Punta Gorda. A few also seem to have fled from Trujillo to Mosquitia, a relatively isolated place where they were safe from irate private citizens as well as government authorities. Another possible contributing factor to the flight from Trujillo can be found in the works of Victor Cruz Reyes, 1986, who notes that cholera was rampant in Honduras in the 1830s. The disease was thought to have entered the territory via Belize in December 1833, and again in 1836 and 1837. Morenos were specifically noted as having brought it back to the woodcutting establishments after visiting relatives in Belize during the Christmas holidays. Since the Black Caribs and others who had joined them were the primary labor force in both of those areas, I think it likely that the Morenos in this case were indeed Caribs, okay? All right, come on now. They're letting you know. We just talking about the Caribs, all right? We're talking about these black folks. The general populace in the interior was terrorized by the threat of this dreaded malady, and the coastal area was ordered closed by the authorities. Records of the Methodist missionaries in Punta Gorda and Stan Creek confirm both the presence of cholera in those towns and the fact that the Caribs were beset by fear and uncertainty. It may be that many fled to Mosquitia simply to avoid the disease. Of course, if they were perceived to have introduced it in Honduras, that would have further contributed to their social isolation. Yeah, they weren't going to fight their brothers, Stanley, you're right. The Central American government recognized and valued the labor potential of the Caribs. So in spite of the general fear of cholera, several efforts were made in 1836 to get them to return to both Guatemala and Honduras. At that time, there were many schemes to encourage European immigration into Central America, and the Caribs were represented as being a ready, willing, and hardworking labor force. They had cleared fields and constructed dwellings for a group of Englishmen known as the Poyais colony, who, after suffering near extinction in Honduras, were moved to the Stan Creek area in 1823. At about the same time, 8 Carib families were persuaded to move to San Felipe and Isabel, in the Gulf of Dulce and Lake Isabel areas. Their presence was intended to improve the defense of the historic route to the interior, thus encouraging both commerce and agricultural development. Following that advice, both the Belgian colony at St. Thomas and the English colony at Abbotsville on the Polochic River near Lake Isabel had employed Caribs as servants, carriers, and field workers. La Compagnie Belge de Colonisation in 1834, a group of Caribs was sent to settle the Pacific port of La Union, but they soon fled. Bisage was stated that the Black Caribs pretty much established their present settlement area and living pattern by about 1820 or 1830, and William Davidson's work seems to echo that view. The data accumulated for this study necessitate another conclusion. Not only was the area between Omoa and Trujillo settled after 1850, but many sites elsewhere were occupied in the early days and subsequently abandoned. The Caribs' earliest settlement was more extensive than today, but excluded the area between Puerto Cortes and Balfante. Oral tradition, ethnohistorical works, and archaeological surveys all indicate that after arriving at Trujillo, the Caribs began almost immediately to seek more attractive settlement sites. Within a year or two, they had investigated the possibilities in Belize, and by 1804, they were familiar with the Mosquito territory near Black River. But from the very beginning in Trujillo, I suspect they rather quickly, perhaps in companies headed by different captains or chiefs, dispersed to such nearby places as the Trujillo Hills, Rio Negro, Cristales, Campamento, Punta Betulia, then Punta de Quemar, and the present villages of Santa Fe, San Antonio, and Guadalupe. These groups probably retained their indigenous social organization and small size, in line with the kind of life to which they had previously been accustomed. All right? Indigenous. So again, where are the Africans? That's right, Stanley. This whole time. Town living, especially in the company of foreigners, would probably have been difficult or at least uncomfortable, given the nature of Carib religious ceremonies. Besides, the early emphasis on agricultural pursuits for the women would have made it more expedient to spread themselves out so as to spend less time getting to the fields. In 1807, there was a significant movement to Mosquitia, followed by the 1832 diaspora described earlier. Before the middle of the 19th century, the Caribs had established small settlements in many places along the Honduran Mosquito Coast. In 1840, they were reported to be living along the coast east of Patuca. All right. Squire stated that the Caribs had had a large association with whites or Europeans. Okay. They now occupy the coast from Trujillo to Caratasca Lagoon. A lot of these people have a lot of, Carib ancestry, okay, that are living there today. Once they have gradually expelled the Sambos or mosquitoes, expelled, they removed them, huh? Their towns are all along the coast near the mouth of various rivers. He went on to note that they not only exported considerable quantities of their vegetable and animal produce, but that the able-bodied Carib men were principally employed in mahogany works, then extant not only in Belize and around Livingston, Guatemala, but also at Trujillo, the Limas or Lamas, today Limon River, and the Roman, today Aguan River, in Honduras, right? So and Methodist missionaries found them well settled at both Stunt Creek and Punta Gorda by 1830. So here's a little table, just real quick. It says Garifuna settlements in 3 Central American countries, all right, guys? So you guys can see Honduras, present day, 19th century, right? So you guys can see present day, that's where a lot of these people settled, the 19th century or the 1800s, right? So present day Belize here, where they can be found, Georgetown, Dangriga, Punta Gorda. So in Honduras, we got all these places today, all right? Limon, Honduras, and then Belize, 19th century. Guatemala, present day, you get find Caribs, Quehueche, Livingston, Rio Salado. And again, all these are present day Honduras on the left here. And then Guatemala, 19th century, right? It says, although William Davidson's analysis of the types of sites they preferred are interesting and useful, they tell us little about the reasons the Caribs had for settling in specific places at certain times. I found oral traditions to be inexact. Most informants assume founding dates much earlier than actual historical or archaeological evidence could confirm. I was also frustrated by the fact that, with one exception, no one could name an ancestor who had been born in St. Vincent. So they already have forgot, their second or third great grandparent or their great grandparents, right? Or even grandparents. Regardless of the ages of my informants, all lines led back to the first generation born in Central America. One man aged 107 said that one of his great grandmothers had come to Central America as a baby. So you guys see, this is why these people who, look, even in his time when he was interviewing people at 107 years old, right? They were babies. They were born there. They were born there. That's how long these people had already been there. And so you can tell them, oh, you guys come from Africa before that. Your ancestors are all slaves from Africa before that. Well, how is he going to know if he can't even verify it with his oral tradition or his family that is gone? Literally what it says here. In fact, there it says, so one man of 107 said that one of his great grandmothers had come to Central America as a baby. Okay? In fact, there were only 6 nursing infants who arrived with the original group, and they were all males. So they had forgot who they were, guys. And of course, people told them, tried to tell them who they were. They added all this hijack and false narratives. It is clear that Trujillo was the original Central American dispersal point, which confirms folk attitudes about its importance in Carib history. Once the original companies had located themselves, individuals, and according to tradition, sets of brothers, some with their wives, ventured out to Belize and down the Mosquito Coast. Each time there was a flare-up, such as in 1807, larger numbers would join those who had already established a beachhead. One observer noted that whenever the Caribs were annoyed or dissatisfied with something, they would simply pack up their belongings and move. Some of the refugees would stay on in the new locations, while others returned to the original sites, thus gradually expanding the boundaries of their effective settlement area. I believe the present towns between Trujillo and Playa began as small farming settlements that grew when mahogany cutting and then banana cultivation became important in the area. Several of these sites, such as the Black River and Siriboya, were once inhabited by the British. It is clear that the Caribs once lived at many places where they are no longer to be found. This is true for the Patuca River area and for Caratasca, Bruce, and Ebans lagoons, for example, which were frequently mentioned as having Carib settlements by travelers of the mid-19th century. According to local informants, the lagoon of Guaymoreto near Trujillo was also once dotted with small settlements, only one of which, Barranco or Blanco, is still extant. Punta Betulia and Campamento are now deserted. At one time, Caribs lived along the outer shore near Punta Castilla, and in the Rio Dulce, Livingston area, there were settlements at Punta Palma, Baltimore, Rio Salado, Punta Manabique, and San Gil or San Gil de Buenavista, as well as along the river Quehueche at Cocoli, and all along the coast up to the present town of Barranco in Belize, all right, all filled with Caribs. These places live on today primarily in folklore, although some locations where rites are performed are sacred to the memory of the ancestors. A complicating factor is just who should be counted as ancestors of the Garifuna. All right, that's the complicated part, huh? Who should be counted as the ancestors, huh? It says at the time of the Black Carib arrival on the Central American coastline, there were numerous Black people already there. All right, there was already so-called Black people already there. So these Black Caribs assimilated with other Black folks that were already there. Who are these Black folks, guys? You can't say they're just Africans. You can't just say that. We got a whole different history that we've gone over. The Caribs were immediately recognized as being somewhat different from the others, primarily because of their language and their non-Western wild appearance. So they're non-Western. So who are these other Blacks that are there? Non-Western, huh? They looked Western. They were clearly distinguished from the Sambos and Mosquitoes, even though both were of Amerindian African stock. That's the hijack. They just means they were black so-called Black Indians. Neither were they ever confused with mulattoes or those of African, Spanish, Indian ancestry. So again, we gotta dodge the hijack when we see it, right? But we understand terms now. Like we went over these terms the other day, right? A general term, morenos, came into use for blacks, usually those whose skin was very dark. So Indians had very dark skin, right? And showed little or no evidence of mixture. Later, moreno came to be synonymous with Garifuna. Now, all of a sudden, it's just Garifuna. But I believe it was just with far more abandon in the early 19th century. Thus, the baptismal records of the Catholic Church variously list peoples as Morenos, Caribes, Caribes Morenos, Morenos Franceses, or Black French, and so on. Less often one finds Negroes, Caribes, or Caribes Pardos. Remember what Pardo meant, never Caribes Mulattoes. So, of course, since many of these dark-skinned people had only recently been brought to the shore from the Caribbean, there may have been a tendency to use the term Caribes in a more generic sense. All right, you guys see? All these terms and tags reclassifying people. In the majority of the baptismal and birth records, only the name of the mother is given, and often there is no surname at all. Thus, the reconstruction of genealogies from these sources is impossible. They left out the dads, huh? What is clear, however, is that there was considerable intermixture among all the Black peoples at the time. That would include with Black French or Black whatever, Black English, Black Scottish, yeah, Black Dutch, even other Black Indians from the area, Black Indians from anywhere else, South America. It was intermixture among all the so-called Black people at the time. In spite of claims to the contrary, both then and now, I conclude that the other Less numerous groups with a different ethnic heritage gradually faded into oblivion as their members mated with and became absorbed by the black Caribs, who were more numerous. You guys see that? This hypothesis helps make sense of a number of otherwise inexplicable bits of information. For example, 300 English blacks were said to be at the site of Campamento, one lead from Trujillo, in 1797. Yet in 1799, the name of one of the black residents there was given as Babiar, a St. Vincent chief. Some Trujillanos today name Campamento as one of the original settlements of the St. Vincent immigrants. Yet surely, as its name implies, it was a military encampment, probably the very one from which the black forces retook Trujillo. All this so-called black history, right, that they leave out, they want to always Africanize, right? A lot of indigenous history here and even black European history here that they leave out of our curriculums, out of our knowledge, awareness. Church records in Trujillo give the name of the people who lived there in the 1850s as Morenos and sometimes Morenos Caribes. The same is true for the village at the mouth of the Chapagua River near Trujillo, which official records say was first established by French blacks. It was what? Made by who? Black French blacks, but was listed as Carib settlement by Alvarado and by William Davison at the present time of Garifuna of Trujillo, say only non-Garifuna blacks live there. Livingston is commonly said to have been settled by a Haitian, and in 1860, a French traveler found there an elderly local leader called Tata Marco. Tata, that's father. That's how we say father in Costa Rica too, who was apparently conversant in French. Other French blacks from Trujillo tried to colonize Roatan in 1829 and 30, but were repulsed by the British superintendent at Belize. In that encounter, an armed Carib from Trujillo claimed to be the Spanish officer in charge. Haskins, in describing the people he called Caribes, said in 1826, most are from St. Vincent, with a few refugees from Santo Domingo. A few of them from Santo Domingo. All right. Huh. On the island of Roatan, there is a non-Garifuna black community known as Camp Bay. Yet several older Garifuna told me that Camp Bay was one of the first sites settled by their ancestors. So they have been reclassified. They don't consider themselves Garifuna, probably. Perhaps before Punta Gorda, where some informants say, and archaeological evidence confirms was founded late in the 19th century by people from the mainland. Jose Rossi and Ruby's original meeting with indigenous people at about the place suggests they were from St. Vincent, but perhaps were not Caribs. Even in the town of Punta Gorda itself, there is a dividing line beyond which lived those black people who claim not to be Garifuna or descended from Garifuna, but who some informants claim really are. Many informants have suggested spontaneously that the people along the coast are completely scrambled, and when genealogies are sought, numerous non-Garifuna ancestors turn up. Some of these are said to have been Mosquito Indians, usually termed Sambos or Huaynas, but others were French, English, and increasingly American blacks. Uh-oh. There were also whites of English, Spanish, and French American ancestry, right? Europeans, some of whom can be traced by their surnames, although the majority of surnames today seem to have been conferred by godparents or adopted from given names, which in some cases appear to have been passed on for generations. So, I think we're gonna go ahead and leave it there. All right. Because it is a lot of reading. It's an hour and a half already. I want to make sure people could actually sit down and watch these presentations so we can go over it little by little. Right. But it's telling you the genealogy, right? Where's the African? Where's the so-called Africans, right? Oh man, this is what I'm saying. I gotta break it down little by little. Know the whole history. Try to catch up on the older videos and you see the history in that region, in these regions, in the area, in the same time periods these people are talking about, so you guys can see other backgrounds, other stories are going on at the same time. Okay. Again, this was the book Sojourners of the Caribbean, Ethnogenesis and Ethnohistory of the Garifuna by Nancy L. Gonzalez. So Nancy, thank you. On the fair use review, criticism, education purposes, you know, just trying to learn, get a little context, more specific history, more specific, not just false narratives, right? More specific history. Yeah. Appreciate you guys who were here in the live and also anybody who tuned in later on. Thank you for finishing the reading with me all the way to the end of at least these two main chapters. And we should definitely get back into it, pull out some stuff. But I just want you guys to remember all the videos that I'm going through recently and before, just so you guys can see how it goes together with everything we're learning, right? You guys seeing who they're really enslaving, relocating. You see the whole history. There's trails, there's paper trails too. There's of the real history. There's no paper trails of the false history because it's false. All right. But yeah, anyways, thank you guys for coming through. All right. Appreciate you guys. I'll give you your day back and your time back. Again, we're just talking about black Caribs. They got deported, relocated, deported from St. Vincent all the way to Central America. But even in St. Vincent, they were all over different places being sent to these places as well. Not just St. Vincent, but mainly there. And there's a whole history of them before there. And are they just Caribs? Also, are they Arawak people? Right? Arawak people. But much love and respect, mi gente. Pura vida, mi gente. Thank you for coming through. I hope you enjoyed the readings. Check out my shorts I'm coming through that are coming through. And yeah, still working on other things on the side, 2 books and all that. And check out my stuff on Patreon and my members only videos. All right, guys. Appreciate you guys for all the support. Much love. All right. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawa, never surrender. Hawa, never surrender.